Ethan Ward was a seasoned building contractor. He'd seen it all: rotting foundations, collapsing roofs, homes that were more of a hazard than a shelter. Over the years, he'd demolished hundreds of houses in terrible condition, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared him for the property he'd just purchased on Ravenbrook Lane. It was a forgotten little corner of the world, a place where time seemed to have stopped. In the center of the overgrown lot stood a tiny, rotting cottage, looking like it might crumble if you so much as sneezed in its direction. It was flanked by 2 collapsing sheds. They were warped and grayed by years of sun and rain. The place was a contractor's nightmare. Termites had feasted on the support beams, turning them into sawdust. Black mold crawled up the walls like a living shadow, and the floorboards were so warped they looked like waves frozen in time. There was absolutely nothing worth saving. The plan was simple: clear the entire lot. Ethan envisioned a sleek, modern home rising from the ashes of this ruin, a testament to new beginnings. One crisp autumn morning, the air was sharp and clean, and the sun cast long shadows across the neglected yard. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat of his bulldozer, the familiar rumble of the engine a comforting sound. His assistant, Mark, a young and energetic guy, was already at work, tossing splintered wood and debris into a large dumpster at the edge of the property. The scene was set for another day of routine demolition. Ethan took a deep breath, lowered the massive steel blade of the bulldozer, and aimed it at the front wall of the dilapidated cottage. As the blade bit into the old wood, the sound of splintering timber filled the air. But along with it came something else. A strange heaviness settled over the property, a sudden, oppressive weight in the air. It felt almost personal, like the very ground beneath him, the land itself, was resisting his efforts. It was a bizarre sensation, one he'd never experienced on a job site before. He tried to shake it off, attributing it to the morning chill or a lack of coffee. He pushed the throttle forward, and the bulldozer groaned as it tore a bigger chunk out of the cottage wall. And that's when he saw her. Out of the corner of his eye, just a flicker of movement. He froze, his hand instinctively pulling back on the controls. There, standing just a few feet behind the massive, churning machine, was an old woman. She wore a faded floral dress, the kind you might see in a photograph from 50 years ago, and a wide-brimmed sunbonnet that shadowed her face. She was leaning heavily on a simple wooden cane, her knuckles white as she gripped it. Her posture was frail, but her eyes burned with a fury that sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Ethan's veins. Her voice, when it came, was sharp and trembling, not with fear, but with an unadulterated, bone-chilling rage. It cut through the noise of the engine like a shard of glass. "What are you doing in my house?" Ethan's heart nearly hammered its way out of his chest. His first thought was safety. No one, absolutely no one, was supposed to be in the demolition zone, let alone directly behind a piece of heavy machinery. It was a death trap. He killed the engine in a panic. The sudden silence, deafening. He scrambled down from the cab, his mind racing. He was ready to scold her, to tell her how reckless she was, how she could have been killed. He rounded the back of the bulldozer, his mouth already open to speak, but she was gone. There was nothing there, just the disturbed dirt and the cool morning air. No footsteps in the soft soil. No sound of a gate clicking shut or branches rustling. Nothing but an eerie, profound silence that was more unsettling than her scream had been. Goosebumps erupted on his arms. The spot where she had stood felt cold. Colder than the rest of the air. Mark jogged over from the dumpster, his face etched with confusion. "Hey, what's up? Why'd you stop?" Ethan stared at him, his own face pale. He pointed to the empty space behind the bulldozer. "Did you see her?" I just saw an old lady right behind me, right here." He tried to keep his voice steady. "She was wearing a bonnet, and she had a cane. She screamed at me." Mark scanned the empty lot, his brow furrowed. He shook his head slowly. "Man, there's no one here. I've been watching this whole side of the property since you started. It's just been you and me." He looked at Ethan with concern. "Are you feeling okay?" Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't explain it. The image of her furious, wrinkled face was burned into his mind. He knew what he'd seen. He knew what he'd heard. It felt more real than the bulldozer he was leaning against. The rest of the day was a blur. Every creak of the old house, every gust of wind, made him jump. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by unseen, angry eyes. That evening, unable to get the woman out of his head, Ethan decided to visit the neighbor next door. It was an older house, well kept, with a garden full of late-blooming flowers. An elderly man with kind eyes answered the door. Ethan introduced himself and explained he was the new owner of the property next door. He felt a bit foolish, but he had to know. "I'm sorry to bother you," he began, "but I had a strange encounter today. An older woman came onto the property. I think I might have scared her. I wanted to apologize." He described her in detail: the faded floral dress, the sunbonnet, the wooden cane, the piercing, angry eyes. As he spoke, he watched the neighbor's friendly expression slowly change. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a look of deep, unsettling unease. The neighbor swallowed hard before speaking. That sounds like Margaret Hensley." Ethan felt a wave of relief. A name. Yes, that could be her. "Do you know where I can find her? I'd really like to talk to her and make sure she's all right." The neighbor didn't meet his gaze. Instead, he looked past Ethan, towards the dark, silhouetted ruin of the cottage next door. His voice dropped to a whisper, a tone laced with something that sounded an awful lot like fear. Margaret lived in that old cottage her whole life. Born in it, raised her family in it. She refused to ever leave the land, even when the town grew up around it and all their old neighbors moved away or passed on. She was attached to that place. Ethan nodded, a bit impatient. "Okay, but where is she now?" The neighbor finally looked back at him, his eyes wide and serious. "You can't talk to her, son." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. Margaret Hensley died 10 years ago. The blood drained from Ethan's face. The air in his lungs turned to ice. It couldn't be. The neighbor continued, his voice barely audible. "She's buried right here in the old Ravenbrook cemetery, just down the road. The whole town knew her story. She always said it, right up to the very end. She swore she would never, ever let anyone tear her house down." Ethan stood frozen on the porch, the friendly neighbor's words echoing in his head. A cold dread, far colder than the autumn night, washed over him. He thought back to that morning, the sudden weight in the air, the face contorted with rage, and that voice, sharp and trembling, cutting through the roar of the engine. He finally understood. It wasn't an old woman he had seen. It was a memory. A warning. Promise. Because earlier that day, when he'd started tearing into that old cottage, Margaret Hensley had screamed at him, like she had never left at all. And Ethan knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, that she was still there, watching and waiting. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more chillin' tales. We'll see you in the next one.